Coming up next, Book TV presents Afterwards, an hour-long interview program where we invite guest hosts to interview authors. This week, Colombia Journal editor Garry Leech talks about his new book, Beyond Bogota, Diary of a Drug War Journalist in Colombia. In the book, Mr. Leech provides a first-hand account of the Colombian government's U.S.-supported war on drugs and the guerrilla groups and farmers who make up its targets. Mr. Leech discusses his book with Josh Rushing, correspondent and military analyst for Al Jazeera English, and host of Al Jazeera English's six-part series on war.
Hey, Garry, thanks for joining us. Let's talk about Beyond Bogota, your time in covering the drug war down in Colombia. Let's step back a little bit and I guess set up the playing field here. What happened in Colombia with La Violencia? What set up the current situation?
Well, yeah, Colombia's violence in its current form has basically been going on since the 1940s, when a populist leader was assassinated in 1948, and that led to a civil war between the two, or followers of the two dominant political parties, the liberals and conservatives. And out of that decade of violence, which killed about 200,000 Colombians, emerged mostly peasant groups who were defending themselves against government repression, who actually started seeking broader structural changes, and many of them became socialist or communist advocates. And these peasant groups ended up taking up arms initially just to defend themselves against the army, and by 1964 they actually officially became the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or the FARC guerrilla movement.
Was Che a part of that or connected with that at all, or an influence on that?
He wasn't so much an influence. Actually, Che, in his motorcycle diaries, was in Colombia in the middle of La Violencia, which this decade of violence through the 50s was called. And he did note in the motorcycle diaries that Colombia, he experienced more repression in Colombia. It was more overt and visible than any other country he'd traveled through on that journey. And so that was a reflection of the conditions that led to this peasant movement forming the guerrillas, as I say, known as the FARC, which today is the largest guerrilla movement in Colombia.
And separate from the FARC, you also have the ELN. What's the ELN?
Yeah, the ELN, the National Liberation Army, they also formed in 1964 officially, but they were more reminiscent of most of the guerrilla groups that formed throughout Latin America following the Cuban Revolution. They were more influenced by Che and Fidel Castro. They were more urban intellectuals who went to the countryside to form guerrilla armies, whereas the FARC predates the Cuban Revolution. Its roots are in the early to mid-50s, and it very much is a peasant-based guerrilla organization, which the ELN is more urban intellectual-led.
And then to confuse things even more, there's another side of this equation that isn't the government and the military, and that's the paramilitaries. So how do they fit in?
Exactly. Throughout the history of Colombia's violence, there's always been paramilitary groups that have come and gone, and these groups work often hand in hand with the military. The latest wave of paramilitaries in Colombia emerged in the early 80s, and they were formed by initially the big cocaine cartels, the Medellin cartel, the Cali cartel, and ostensibly to defend themselves against, and their family members, against kidnapping by the guerrillas. But the military and large landowners also formed paramilitary organizations to defend their economic interests from the guerrillas, and the military to wage a dirty war against not only the guerrillas, but any peasants believed to be sympathizers of the guerrillas, and anyone on the left, basically, whether you're a politician, unionists, human rights defenders, community organizers. And the paramilitaries worked hand in glove with the Colombian military, and they did the dirty work, or a lot of the dirty work, for the Colombian military. And throughout the 80s and 90s, they were primarily responsible for most of the human rights abuses, particularly the massacres.
Well, why do they call it the dirty war? Because of that? Because of the massacres? And what massacres are you talking about?
Yeah, the actual combat, traditional combat, takes place between either the paramilitaries and the guerrillas or the army and the guerrillas. But there's also a dirty war in Colombia, and it's called dirty because it's the targeting of civilians, unarmed civilians. And again, that's primarily been carried out through the 80s and 90s by the paramilitaries. What it is they see anyone who works for social change as a subversive, as a communist, anyone that challenges the government's policies, speaks out against the government, or tries to organize social movements in any way, non-violently, they're automatically assumed to be guerrillas, guerrilla sympathizers. And so the dirty war is the targeting of these citizens, Colombians, who are working non-violently to change the political, social, and economic structures of the country.
Okay, so that sets the stage. Now, you have a bit of an odd background, right? You're from two places. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was born in England, and my formative years were in England. I left when I was 15 and moved from Manchester, England to Detroit.
That's a big change.
Yeah, or one industrial city to another, but yeah, a cultural shift. And
at 15, that's a tough time to move like that for that big of a cultural shift, right?
Yes, it was. I had my last 2 years in high school in Detroit, and yeah, I wasn't happy with the move. It was, I felt like an outsider. At 15, everyone's got their cliques already, their friends, and where I moved to, most of the people had been, going through the school system together their whole lives. So I never found a clique. I was kind of an outsider, and so when I graduated, my first instinct was to get out of there. Mm-hmm. So, and I had, I guess, an adventurous spirit, so I just decided, okay, I'm going to take off, and I'd never been to the West Coast, so Los Angeles is where I headed to, just for a sense of adventure. I had no career goals or ambitions at that time. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, so I guess it was the traditional, I'm going to go out and find myself or something. But so I ended up in Los Angeles, and then decided I wanted to go further astray, but had no money. This was in 1979, and actually a friend I met in Los Angeles was a former Marine, and talking to him, and decided, what, why not enlist in the Marines and see if I can get sent overseas and experience a different country. And that's what I did.
Were you a U.S. citizen?
Not at that time, no. I hadn't become a citizen yet. I became a citizen later on, but at that time I was still a British citizen.
So you're a British citizen enlisting in the most extreme of the armed services, and I say that as a former Marine.
Yeah.
That's an odd thing, right?
Yeah, and again for me it was this, I guess, the sense of adventure. I was out there seeking adventure. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to be out there in the world, experiencing different things. And as you say, the most extreme of the U.S. Armed Forces.
It's as much a cult as it is a military service.
Exactly, and again, it fit my personality. It's like, because my exact thinking was, okay, if I'm going to join the military, it's going to be the one that's the most challenging, and so that was.
Well, did you ever wonder if you joined the Army, would you always wonder if you could have made it as a Marine? Like
probably,
that kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly.
I went through that, I know. Because I went and saw the other recruiters, and to me, I was like, I'll always wonder if I could have made it through the Marines. So you were in the Marines for a few years.
Yeah.
And then you get out.
Yep.
How did you find yourself down in this Colombia thing? So attracted to what was going on there?
Well, it was the Marines that introduced me to Latin America, because I was stationed in Panama. I got my overseas posting, and I got to experience, a different culture. And Panama was fascinating, but I realized it was a place, because the Canal Zone was still in existence at the time. This is 1980. That was very influenced and dominated by Americans, because of 34,000 military personnel there and civilians. So when I got out the Marines, I decided I want to go back and experience more of Central America at that time, and because my curiosity had been raised. And so actually I traveled down from Detroit down to Panama and back, basically hitchhiking, taking buses, and on a 3-month trip. Half of it was with my brother Don, and but when I returned, I was traveling alone.
You got yourself in a bit of trouble there, yeah? Which would become a theme in your life, as you write about in the book.
Yeah, maybe I need to talk to someone about that.
You have segments in your life that seem to exist in between periods of captivity, and
exactly.
Which should be a warning to you right now.
Exactly. And I'm headed to Colombia next week.
Are you really?
Yeah.
Well, tell us about this time in, what was it? It was El Salvador, yeah?